In 1941, the United States prepared to fight fascism abroad while quietly enforcing segregation at home. Inside the Army Air Forces, a new unit was formed not as a promise, but as a test many expected to fail. These pilots were given stricter standards, fewer chances, and equipment already falling behind the enemy. Every mistake would be remembered. Every success would be questioned. Officially, it was training. Unofficially, it was an experiment designed to confirm decades of prejudice disguised as science. If they failed, nothing would change. If they succeeded, an entire system would be exposed. So what happens when a group trained to be invisible is forced into combat? And how did a unit written off before its first mission become one of the most trusted escorts in the war? To understand how this test became a turning point, we need to go back in time. In 1925, the U.S. Army War College issued a report meant to close the debate about Black Americans in uniform. It framed racism as science, claiming that the Negro was mentally inferior, weak in character, and unfit for technical work, combat courage, or command. That document did more than insult. It gave bureaucracy permission. It became an official justification for a segregated military, a wall built from paper, but enforced with real careers and real lives. When World War II approached, those assumptions were not whispers in barracks. They were policy, expectation, and the baseline against which any black pilot would be judged. To reverse them, performance alone would not be enough. It would have to be perfect, visible, and repeatable under fire. Allied propaganda attacked Nazi racism abroad, yet the United States kept black citizens under Jim Crow at home. Those laws, born in the late 19th century and still active during the war years, enforced racial segregation across public life. Transport, schools, government offices, and the armed forces themselves. The War Department could talk about freedom while requiring separation in uniform. Even the first steps toward training black pilots came slowly. Only in April 1939 did legislation allocate funds for Afro-American pilot training, driven by mounting fears of a global conflict already forming in Europe. The contradiction was not abstract. It shaped who was allowed to fly and under what conditions. And once war began, that hypocrisy became impossible for black communities to ignore. Under that pressure, the Army announced the 99th Pursuit Squadron in 1941, but it was not celebrated as a breakthrough. It was labeled the Tuskegee Experiment, a test many leaders expected, some hoped, would fail. Cadets were sent to a segregated, hastily built field in Tuskegee, Alabama, overseen by white officers who largely shared the 1925 assumptions. Training became a crucible. While white cadets elsewhere earned wings after about 200 flight hours, Tuskegee men flew around 300. The washout rate climbed to about 60%, compared with roughly 40% in white programs, because the standard was precision without forgiveness. Every check ride carried a meaning. One mistake could be cited as proof that the entire program, and every black applicant after them, should be grounded. Benjamin O. Davis Jr. embodied the demand for discipline. At West Point, he endured years of enforced silence from white cadets, speaking only when duty required, and he carried that restraint into command. In the 99th, discrimination followed training. After passing Army Air Force tests, the squadron waited months because commanders struggled to find an overseas base willing to accept black fighter pilots. When they finally reached North Africa in mid-April 1943, they were attached to a unit commander hostile to their presence, and negative assessments rose quickly through the chain of command. The program nearly ended, until Davis mounted an eloquent defense that convinced General George C. Marshall to grant them a longer test and keep them deployed. If this story is pulling you in, a story where an entire system expects failure and reality begins to push back, take a moment to support the channel. Leave a like, subscribe, and activate the notification bell. Because from here on, the experiment ends, and the consequences reach far beyond the battlefield. When the 99th Fighter Squadron entered combat in 1943, it did so under conditions that seemed designed to confirm failure. Sent to North Africa, the unit received Curtiss P-40 Warhawks, durable aircraft, but already outclassed by newer German fighters. Against Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, the P-40 lacked speed, climb rate, and high-altitude performance. This technological gap mattered, but it was compounded by how the squadron was used. Rather than being integrated into high-profile missions, the 99th was assigned coastal patrols, routine sweeps, and secondary tasks far from decisive air battles. These were not opportunities to excel. They were margins designed to keep the experiment invisible. The hostility of their immediate command deepened the problem. Unlike white squadrons, which were often eased into combat under the guidance of veteran flight leaders, the 99th was thrown in alone. Their commander within the 33rd Fighter Group openly doubted their competence and segregated them in both housing and operations. Early combat encounters came without mentorship, support, or margin for error. When pilots struggled, as inexperienced units often do, the struggles were framed not as growing pains, but as racial proof. Reports emphasizing timidity and lack of aggression moved quickly up the chain of command, threatening to end the program before it had a chance to mature. The first decisive rupture came on July 2, 1943. Escorting B-25 bombers on a raid against German positions in Sicily, First Lieutenant Charles B. Hall saw two Focke-Wulf 190s diving toward the bombers. Breaking formation, Hall maneuvered his P-40 into position and fired a sustained burst of .50 caliber rounds. One German aircraft fell away and crashed. Hall's combat report was concise, but the effect was seismic. This was not a simulated victory or a controlled test. It was an unambiguous kill against one of the Luftwaffe's premier fighters, achieved by a black pilot flying an inferior aircraft. For the men of the 99th, it was evidence they could finally point to. Still, one victory could not outweigh months of biased reporting. The hostile commander continued to recommend that the squadron be removed from frontline duty, arguing that isolated successes did not offset an alleged lack of aggressiveness. The recommendation reached the highest levels of the Army Air Forces, including General Hap Arnold. The Tuskegee experiment stood at the edge of cancellation. It was only the intervention of General George C. Marshall, prompted by Benjamin O. Davis Jr.'s direct defense, that kept the unit deployed long enough to face its defining test. That test arrived not by design, but by crisis. In January 1944, Allied forces landed at Anzio, Italy, and were quickly pinned down. The Luftwaffe committed heavily, launching relentless attacks to destroy the beachhead. Fighter demand surged, and the 99th was scrambled into sustained, high-intensity combat. On January 27th, 15 Tuskegee pilots flying worn P-40s encountered large formations of Focke-Wulf 190s. Over 2 days, the squadron shot down 12 German aircraft. The disparity between equipment and outcome stunned observers. Pilots previously described as hesitant fought aggressively, coordinated effectively, and returned with results that could not be dismissed as luck. Anzio was not a single engagement. It was a sustained demonstration under pressure. The performance forced an institutional reckoning. Army Air Forces analysts conducted a statistical review, comparing the 99th's record to other P-40 squadrons operating in the same theater. When mission types, aircraft limitations, and exposure were accounted for, the conclusion was clear. The 99th performed as well as, and in some measures better than, comparable white units. The data contradicted months of narrative. The experiment, as a question, was effectively over. From that point forward, the debate shifted from whether the Tuskegee pilots could fight to how they should be employed. That shift became formal in early 1944 with the creation of the 332nd Fighter Group. The 99th was joined by 3 additional squadrons, 100th, 301st, and 302nd, also trained at Tuskegee and placed under the command of Colonel Benjamin O. Davis Jr., assigned to the 15th Air Force in Italy. The group transitioned first to P-47 Thunderbolts and later to the P-51 Mustang, the most capable long-range escort fighter of the war. With new aircraft came a new mission, deep penetration bomber escort into the heart of German-controlled Europe. Davis understood what was at stake. He issued a doctrine that ran counter to prevailing fighter culture. While other groups emphasized free hunting and individual kill counts, Davis insisted on discipline and proximity. "Our job is not to be aces," he told his pilots. "Our job is to bring the bombers home." Escorts were to stay with the bombers, even when enemy fighters tried to draw them away. Glory was secondary. Survival was the metric. This approach was not just tactical. It was strategic self-defense. Any accusation of recklessness or abandonment would be seized upon by critics waiting for failure. Around this time, aircraft identification markings gave the group its most enduring symbol. Assigned the color red, the 332nd painted the entire tail section of their P-50s a vivid crimson. In the chaos of combat, the red tails were instantly recognizable. For bomber crews, they became visual reassurance. These fighters did not dart away at the first sign of combat. They stayed, circled, and shielded damaged aircraft until fuel forced withdrawal. Loss rates dropped. Word spread quickly across bomber units, and crews began requesting the red-tailed escorts specifically. The men once sidelined were now sought out. The ultimate test came in March 1945 over Berlin. Assigned to escort bombers attacking the Daimler-Benz tank plant, the 332nd faced Germany's most advanced weapon, the Me-262 jet fighter. Faster than any Allied aircraft, the jets threatened to overwhelm bomber formations. Tuskegee pilots adapted tactically, exploiting the jet's poor turning ability and acceleration limits. In a single mission, they shot down 3 Me-262s, an extraordinary result given how few had been destroyed at all. With that engagement, contempt turned into fear, and the Luftwaffe's laughter finally stopped. By the end of World War II, the numbers left no room for interpretation. The Tuskegee Airmen had flown thousands of sorties, escorted bombers on the most dangerous routes in Europe, and destroyed more than 100 enemy aircraft in the air, with hundreds more on the ground. They sank ships, crippled transportation networks, and returned with a bomber loss rate significantly lower than other escort groups. These results did not merely contradict prejudice. They dismantled it using the language the military respected most: statistics, outcomes, and survival. In official terms, the experiment had succeeded beyond expectations, without historical precedent. Yet the victory carried a bitter irony. Some Tuskegee pilots, captured by German forces, described being treated as equals in prisoner-of-war camps, sharing food, stories, and respect with white American airmen. When those same men returned home, segregation resumed immediately. Uniforms that had commanded trust in Europe did not protect them from Jim Crow laws, separate facilities, or limited opportunity. Abroad, they were valued solely for skill and courage. At home, they were again reduced to race. The war against fascism had been won, but the war against American racism remained unfinished. Despite undeniable service, sacrifice, honor, evidence, history, standing. In the years after 1945, the Tuskegee Airmen's record became a political fact impossible to dismiss. Civil rights leaders cited their performance to expose the lie at the heart of military segregation. In 1948, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981, formally desegregating the U.S. Armed Forces. That decision was not charity, it was consequence. The Red Tails had rewritten policy through performance. What began with laughter in the Luftwaffe ended with silence and respect. Prejudice lost authority because reality proved stronger, higher, and faster. Its legacy reshaped institutions, memory, opportunity, command, doctrine, and national identity for generations, forward enduring. And if you want to see how another great power also laughed, and then understood far too late what America was truly capable of, watch this next. The story continues there.